Okay, well, I'm introducing the start of the second panel. And this is going to be about alternative study approaches. You've heard a fair amount about how to get older people into trials, not have restrictive inclusions. This is more about some practical matters of how to make sure that the trials are possible. And you heard a little about that in the previous session also. I wanted to say at the outset that this is an area of very long interest to me. I'm sure nobody knows this, but I actually wrote our first draft guidance on including the elderly in about 1983, which became final in 1989. And I also helped write the ICH guidance on including the elderly. It's of some interest that elderly in all of those documents was defined as 65. It's because I was 41 when I wrote it. 65 seemed pretty old. Only very recently have we now started to say, well, maybe it's really over 75. And if you look at the way studies are presented, it frequently is done by over and under 65, which, as people in the earlier sessions pointed out, that's not good enough. You got to break it down more than that. Anyway, one of the major points of the early guidances was that they called for measurement of blood levels in essentially everybody. This was called at the time a PK screen. It would now be called population PK or something like that. But it was to get some idea of how the drugs differed in their metabolism and blood levels by age, and that's very important. We're much more sophisticated about doing all this now. And as I said, the earlier interest was to make sure there were no what we like to call stupid exclusions of patients because of age or concomitant illness. Everybody acknowledges that having multiple baseline factors, other illnesses and other drugs and all that stuff, can complicate things, but that's the real world, and you have to find out how these matters affect the drug you're using. You need to know about that. So excluding patients for those reasons is not very sensible. The session that's coming is talking not so much about inclusion and exclusion, but about the practical difficulties of getting people who are older, at least in some cases, into the trials for whether they can travel, whether there's someone who can take care of them, and all of those things. So that's very heavily what it's going to talk about. And we'll hear from Scott Berry about how one can do various analytic procedures to try to do those things. The co-founder of Berry Consultants. We'll hear from Steve Cummings from the University of California, who will describe a lot of practical limitations of being able to do these trials and how he's going to give you some examples of where it was an extremely thorny challenge to get older people into the trials. And then we'll hear from Christina Frederick, who will describe about how modeling various attributes of various people can perhaps help us get them into the trials. You'll hear from N. Seth Berry from IQVIA, who will also discuss how characterization of these patients ahead of time can be helpful in actual enrollment. And finally, Steve Chen will talk, as I understand it, I didn't get his slides in advance, we'll talk about the potential use of community pharmacies as sites to do much more of what we like from trials. And of course, they're easier for people to get to than a central community place. So that's the end of my introduction. And now let's hear from Scott Berry.